They say the smoke never stopped. Not through drought, not through war, not even when the bodies were still warm. It rose in thick gray curls above the pines, heavy with the smell of salt, blood, and hickory. If you stood on the church steps at dawn, you'd see it bleed into the sunrise like a bruise. And if you listened long enough, through the hiss of steam and the clink of steel, you might swear you heard something else. Chewing. Slow. Rhythmic. Reverent. Wilton's Hollow wasn't much. A sawmill town tucked behind the Alabama pines, forgotten by maps and protected by silence. A single railroad line passed through it, though trains rarely stopped. A general store, a one-room chapel, and rows of shotgun houses built too close to the earth. Dirt roads, rusted fences, and the buzzing of flies were constants. But ask anyone what fed the town, what kept its people full when others starved, and they'd tell you one word: the Creoles. Ephraim and Silas Creel owned the slaughterhouse on the far edge of the hollow, where the trees grew black and the dirt turned red from rain. No one else dared live that close to the pines. The ground was too soft, the air too still. But the Creoles? They were different. Ephraim spoke with the calm of a man who'd never known fear. Always clean, always composed, always quoting scripture. Silas was simpler, mute since childhood, his eyes blank as butcher paper, his hands always working. Between them, they ran the most efficient meatworks in the county, and their smokehouse, God help us, never stopped breathing. And neither did the hunger. Before we descend into what was truly fed in Wilton's Hollow, make sure you're subscribed to Ancestral Fear, where true terror isn't imagined. It's remembered. Hit that like button, share this with someone who loves dark history, and click the bell so you never miss another buried truth. Because some stories, they were smoked, salted, and served before they were ever told. Now, let's begin. It was the spring of 1861 when the hunger returned. The crops had failed again, just like the year before. Black rot crept into the corn. Chickens went stiff in their coops. The war had started stirring, and every able-bodied man with a rifle had already marched north. The town's remaining men were old, broken, or hiding injuries behind patched coats. Meat had become memory, except of course at the edge of town. At the slaughterhouse, there was always meat, wrapped in wax paper, still warm, stamped with the Creole seal, a burnt brand of a crossed cleaver and crown. Delivered by Ephraim himself every Sunday morning, basket swinging from his arm, coat spotless. He'd greet each home with the same gentle phrase, "The Lord provides." People accepted the packages. No one asked how. Sometimes a child would ask, "Where are the cows?" And the answer was always the same: brought in at night, after you're asleep. But there were no tracks, no mooing in the dark, just smoke and that smell, that rich, copper-sweet scent of roasting flesh. Verity Talbot, the town schoolteacher, was the first to question it aloud. "Has anyone actually seen a delivery, a cart, a cow?" The mayor chuckled. "Miss Talbot, you've been reading too many abolitionist papers. We're blessed, that's all. Ephraim Creel is a godly man." "But there's no blood in the road," she pressed, "and no bones in the trash." Silence. Then a neighbor said, "Why ruin a good thing with bad thoughts?" And that was that. Wilton's Hollow was not a place for questions. The Creole slaughterhouse stood like a wound in the forest, built low and wide, roof slanted like a crooked grin, iron chimney always hissing. Its outer wall was stained with years of smoke. The windows were too small, the front gate always locked. It was said that Silas once dragged a live boar through the side door with one arm, his eyes blank, his apron already bloodied. No one ever entered the building but the brothers. Even the mayor didn't know what was inside. Rumors came and went that the Creoles had discovered a breed of hogs that bred in the trees, that they'd signed a government contract, that they used Confederate corpses from distant skirmishes. Waste not, want not, someone had whispered after too much whiskey, but no one believed any of it, because believing meant looking, and looking meant seeing, and seeing meant choosing between meat and morality. The choice was always meat. Then came the traveler, a man in a brown coat with a wide-brimmed hat, dragging a cane, his face burned down one side like wax. He walked into Wilton's Hollow on a Tuesday and asked the wrong question. Where do they keep the livestock? The townspeople went quiet. The general store clerk muttered something about private land. The mayor asked the man's name. Cain, he said, tipping his hat. Matthew Cain, railroad surveyor. That wasn't true. Not exactly. Cain took a room above the chapel and began walking the town, observing, asking. Ever wonder why the slaughterhouse never stops running? They've got a deal. With who? They're generous folk. Ever seen a butcher who doesn't buy pigs? People turned cold. Some stopped talking to him altogether. Others stared too long. That Sunday, Ephraim delivered a wrapped roast to the mayor's door. The label read, "Special cut, fresh." The mayor served it at dinner without a word. Cain didn't eat. He watched. He listened. That night, as the town slept, he walked to the edge of the woods and stood by the slaughterhouse fence. The smoke stung his eyes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a scrap of paper. On it were 9 names, and a question. Where are the bones? Behind the chimney, something moved. A shape, low to the ground, watching him back. Cain didn't flinch. He folded the paper, tucked it into his coat. Then he turned and walked into the dark. The chewing had started again. The next morning, the rain returned. Not the kind that cleanses. This was southern rain. Thick, lukewarm, full of rust and memory. It dripped from the eaves of the chapel and turned the dirt roads into slow-moving sludge. The townspeople moved through it without umbrellas, heads down, boots half swallowed in the mud. But the slaughterhouse smoke never faltered. If anything, it grew darker, greasier, the kind of smoke that clings to skin long after you've gone home. Cain sat on the chapel's back steps, his burned cheek glistening from the mist. His left hand cradled a small notebook, its leather cover worn thin. Inside, diagrams, train routes, missing persons reports, hand-drawn maps of Wilton's Hollow. His handwriting was small but precise. On one page he'd written, Creole property. No livestock pens, no transport wagons, no delivery manifests, no waste disposal, and beneath that, in heavy ink, everything in, nothing out. He closed the notebook as Verity Talbot approached, her shoes soaked through and her shawl pulled tight against the wind. You keep watching that place like it owes you something, she said quietly. Cain didn't answer at first. His eyes remained fixed on the chimney, barely visible through the mist. I've watched towns like this before, he finally replied. They always have a center, a thing they orbit around, whether they know it or not. And you think it's the Creoles? Cain nodded. I don't think it. I smell it. I hear it. That smoke. It's not animal. Verity sat beside him, careful not to let their shoulders touch. You talk like a man who's seen worse. I have. War? No, Cain said. Work. She watched him, lips pursed, waiting. But he offered nothing else, just that burnt-cheeked stare into the pines. Behind them, the chapel bell rang once. It was Wednesday. That meant deliveries. At exactly noon, Ephraim Creel emerged from the fog as he always did, walking the same path through town with a wicker basket draped over one arm. His coat was green today, double-breasted, immaculate. Silas followed a few paces behind, dragging a handcart covered in waxed linen. The cloth was speckled with something dark and drying. "Afternoon, Miss Talbot," Ephraim said as he passed the schoolhouse gate. "Brother Cain." Cain tipped his hat, but said nothing. Verity nodded stiffly. The smell from the cart was sweet, pungent, honey, and rot. "Supplying the mayor again?" Cain asked. Ephraim stopped, turned. His smile was friendly, but his eyes were stone. "We feed who needs feeding," he said. "Isn't that the Lord's way?" Cain rose. "The Lord didn't run a slaughterhouse." Ephraim chuckled softly. "Depends which testament you read." Silas tugged at his sleeve. Ephraim looked down, then back at Cain. "You'll excuse us. Blessings to you both." They continued on, the handcart creaking behind them. Cain watched until they vanished behind the post office. "That man frightens me," Verity whispered. Cain shook his head. "That man's a mask. The one behind him, that's the butcher." That night, Cain followed them. From the shadows near the apothecary, he tracked their return path. The brothers made no effort to hide. Silas pushed the empty cart back through town, Ephraim humming a hymn Cain didn't recognize, something slow, almost sorrowful. They didn't speak. They never looked back. Cain kept his distance, ducking behind fences and brush, careful not to snap a twig. The path to the slaughterhouse curved behind the old quarry and dipped into the trees. As the brothers disappeared past the gate, Cain crept closer. The slaughterhouse loomed in the mist like a sleeping animal, low, squat, and exhaling slow trails of gray from its chimney. The scent was overwhelming up close. Not just meat, metal, fat, steam, and something else, something acidic, almost medicinal. Cain scaled the outer fence and dropped into the mud with a soft grunt. He kept low, circling the side of the building. No lights from the windows. No sound except the drip of rainwater and the low wheeze of the chimney's breath. He found a small grate near the foundation, rusted but still venting warm air. Carefully, he knelt beside it and peered in. Inside, shadows flickered. The interior was cleaner than expected. Not industrial, surgical. A long steel table gleamed beneath gas lanterns. Hooks lined the far wall in neat rows. Buckets stood at attention beneath a drainage grate. Along one shelf sat mason jars filled with a dark amber liquid. And on the table, Cain flinched, a hand, small, pale, fingers splayed. Someone moved behind it, Silas, shirtless, apron tied, his back slick with sweat. He lifted the hand with reverence, then placed it into a large pot. He stirred. The bones clinked. Cain crawled back, heart thudding. He tripped over a root and caught himself before crying out. Then he heard it. A voice. Ephraim, inside, calm, low. Offer it up, cleanse it, strip it of name, sin, memory. Flesh to ash, ash to grace. Cain didn't wait. He ran. Back through the trees, through the mud, through the quiet town where lanterns flickered behind closed shutters and no one dared look out. By the time he reached the chapel, his boots were soaked, his hands bleeding, and his notebook damp with sweat. He bolted the door, lit a candle, and sat in the dark. On a new page, he wrote, "Slaughterhouse equal altar. Silas butchers. Ephraim blesses. They believe they're saving souls." Question. From what? At dawn, Ephraim Creel stood at the chapel door, holding a parcel. "Brother Cain," he called softly, "you forgot your gift." Cain didn't open the door. He waited until the footsteps faded. Then, carefully, he opened the package. Inside, a slab of meat, marbled and red, glistening with oil, and atop it, tied with twine, a single white lily. The flower was still wet, not with dew, not with rain, with blood. Matthew Cain didn't sleep that night, not even in fits. He sat in the chapel loft, knees drawn to his chest. The candle burned down to a wax puddle. When dawn broke, he didn't feel it. His mind buzzed with images, the hand, the hymn, Silas stirring the pot like a mother preparing broth, the jars, the hooks, the way Ephraim had said his name as if he were already dead, and the flower. He'd burned it at first light, set fire to the whole parcel in the chapel hearth. The meat cracked and hissed, a sweet sour stench rising like rot in bloom. The lily sizzled black in seconds. Cain didn't watch it burn. He'd already turned to the pages in his notebook. He wasn't writing anymore, he was carving, etching each line so deep the paper nearly tore. This wasn't hunger. This was worship. By midday, he was back in the village square, face drawn, eyes red. The townsfolk gave him wide berth. Word had traveled. Cain had turned down Creole meat. He'd refused the gift. That made him odd, dangerous. In Wilton's Hollow, you didn't spit on charity. Even the mayor avoided him. Only Verity met his eye. She stepped out from the schoolhouse, wiping chalk from her hands, and whispered, "You saw something." Cain nodded. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me." They walked to the edge of town, past the dry well and the rusted bell tower that hadn't rung since the last wedding. 3 years passed. Cain recounted what he saw in low tones. The surgical room, the hand, the jars, the prayer. He didn't mention the lily. Verity listened without flinching. "They think it's sacred," she said when he finished. Cain turned to her. "You don't doubt me?" "I've taught children here for 10 years, she said, "and every year, 1 or 2 go missing. A fever, a runaway, a flood, always an excuse, but never a search, never a body. I stopped asking after they called me cursed." Cain looked at her, truly looked, at the tightness in her jaw, the way she held her arms across her chest. She had known for a long time, maybe not the details, but the silence. She'd heard it loudest. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "These are the names I've traced. People who passed through, drifters, soldiers, even a preacher, last seen near the Creole's property. No confirmed departures, no farewells, just disappeared." Verity read through them slowly, mouth tightening. "I recognize 2. Cain pointed at the bottom. "See that one? Elias Granger, Union spy, disguised as a circuit preacher, came through 4 months ago, logged by the rail company, never reached the next parish." Verity's eyes narrowed. That was the month they held the harvest feast. Cain nodded. They stopped walking. Ahead was the slaughterhouse road, the trees parting like a wound in the forest. "Why not tell the sheriff?" she asked. Cain snorted. "He eats from the same hand as everyone else." "Then what do we do?" Cain looked past the trees, toward the black plume curling above the roofline. "We keep watching. We catch them in the act. Or we find something they can't explain away." That evening, Cain returned to the boarding house. Mrs. Lively, the owner, didn't meet his eyes. She slid his dinner across the counter without a word. Ham, cornbread, beans. He pushed the plate back. "I'd like to visit the rail yard," he said. "Anyone around who used to work the line?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Only one left is Delmer Rusk. Lives out by the burned depot. Don't see him much." Cain nodded. "Thanks." He left the food untouched. Out at the edge of town, the old rail depot sagged under its own weight, a broken spine of splintered wood and sunken stone. The war had shifted rail priorities. Wilton's Hollow had been left behind. Delmer Rusk lived in the last car, propped up on bricks and overgrown with kudzu. Cain knocked once. "You with the army?" A voice barked from inside. "No," Cain said. "Rail Survey. Cain's the name." The door creaked open. Delmer was thin, pale, with eyes like boiled milk. He looked past Cain, then back at him. "You the one poking around the creels?" Cain nodded. Delmer stepped aside. "Then come in, before someone sees." The inside smelled of turpentine and old books. Cain sat on a milk crate. Delmer lit a lantern. "I worked the line 10 years, Delmer said. "Saw all kinds. But that slaughterhouse? That thing ain't right. We used to offload barrels to 'em. Crates too heavy for one man. But never any livestock, no feed, no hay, just salt, a lot of salt." Cain leaned forward. "What was in the crates?" Delmer looked away. "Didn't ask. Weren't paid to ask. But you saw something." The old man hesitated, then reached under the floorboard and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a metal tag, bent and rusted. It read, "E. Granger, Chaplain." "Found that in a returned crate," Delmer whispered. "They said it was empty. It wasn't." Cain felt the blood drain from his face. "You tell anyone?" Delmer nodded once. "The next day, my dog went missing. 2 days later, I found its skin on my porch, nothing else." Silence filled the car. Cain rose. "I need this tag." Delmer handed it over. "They're not butchers, son. They're priests of something old, something that feeds." Cain left in the dark. That night, the wind shifted. The smoke curled lower, hugging the roads, seeping into cracks under doorways and between floorboards. And with it came the scent. Rich, metallic, honeyed. It coated the tongue like guilt. Verity opened her window and gagged. She looked toward the trees. In the distance, the slaughterhouse chimney glowed red. Inside the chapel, Cain placed the tag beside his notebook. Then he locked the door and loaded his revolver. The chewing had started again, and this time it was closer. By the end of the week, the air in Wilton's Hollow felt different. Not just heavy, charged, like the quiet before a storm, or the moment before a blade meets skin. The townspeople moved slower. Doors creaked open with more suspicion. Dogs barked at nothing, then whimpered away from the smoke. And still, the slaughterhouse breathed. The chimney hissed, the cart rolled. Ephraim Creel walked with his polished boots and folded scripture, nodding to each home like a shepherd among sheep. Silas stayed in the shadows, always one step behind, wiping his hands with rags that never came clean. Cain spent those days in records. The back room of the chapel held ledgers, baptisms, marriages, deaths, and the meat registry kept by the mayor's office. Each shipment into Wilton's Hollow was supposed to be logged. Cain turned each brittle page, fingers blackened with ink and dust. Dozens of entries. February 12th, 180 hubs pork shoulder, Creel Bros. March 3rd, 240 calves ribs, Creel Brothers. April 10, 310 ounce hubs, mixed cuts, Creel Bros. Always arriving, never departing. Cain frowned. He flipped forward. May, June, July. No purchases, no invoices, no animal transport. He found the clerk, a boy barely 17 named Jonah Phelps, sitting outside the post office with a slingshot and a sunburn. "How are these shipments coming in?" Cain asked, holding the ledger open. Jonah blinked. "They drop 'em off." "No, I mean before that. Where's the product coming from?" "No records of livestock, no orders from the stockyard." Jonah scratched his chin. "Guess they get it from up north. Maybe private supply. You'd have to ask the mayor." Cain closed the book. "And if I wanted to see the original invoices?" Jonah hesitated. They're stored." "Where?" "In the vault. Town hall cellar." "Can I see them?" Jonah shook his head. "Not without the mayor's key. Ain't no one seen that key in years. It's more ceremonial." Cain's jaw clenched. "And you've never asked?" Jonah looked away. "They feed us." That night, Cain returned with a crowbar. The town hall was locked, but not well. A shim in the side door gave him access in under a minute. Inside, the building creaked like a sleeping animal. He moved fast, light low, notebook in his teeth. He found the cellar stairs hidden behind a sagging curtain of mold and old wallpaper. The vault door was worse than he feared. Rusted iron, triple locked. But the hinges? Rotten. 30 minutes of silent work, one bolt at a time. Then he was inside. The smell hit him first. Not dust, not rot. Salt. The room was lined with shelves. Boxes, crates, sealed tins. But one stack caught his eye. A pile of cloth-bound ledgers labeled with faded ink. Jubilee. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3. Cain pulled the top ledger and opened it. It was not a shipment record. It was a butcher's book, but not for animals. Each page held a name, a weight, and a note. L. Thatcher, 123 Aldoncios, quiet. Took well to brine. MC Kemp, 130 Sanalbs, too lean, sour in finish. E. Granger, 155 Salis, devout, tender, stewed. H. Bleak, 98 lbs, small. Sweet, good for sausage. The ink was neat, the handwriting elegant. Each name a life, each note a eulogy in reverse. Cain's hands trembled. He opened another. Same pattern, more names. Some marked redeemed with a small red stamp, others marked waste. At the back of the third book, a symbol was drawn, a circle of teeth surrounding a cross, etched in blood. Cain staggered back. He clutched the ledger, stuffed it beneath his coat and turned. And froze. Someone had entered the hall above. Slow, deliberate footsteps across wood. Cain crept to the edge of the cellar stairs, heart hammering. He saw the silhouette of a figure standing at the top. Tall, broad-shouldered, a glint of metal in one hand, a lantern in the other, Ephraim. Cain backed into the shadows. "Brother Cain?" came the voice, smooth and warm. "You left chapel early tonight. You must have missed the hymn. Silas sang." Cain said nothing. "You know, I'm glad you're here," Ephraim continued, walking slowly down the steps. "This town, it takes time to understand. The way things work. What's owed, what's given." Cain drew his revolver slowly, silently. "See, the people of Wilton's Hollow, they've forgotten what it means to tithe. Real tithing, not money, not wheat, but flesh. Flesh is honest. Flesh has memory." The voice came closer. The lantern flicked around the edge of the cellar. Cain stepped sideways behind a crate, finger on the trigger. "We've served this town for years," Ephraim said. "Never once asked for thanks. Only obedience, only silence. You've brought noise, Cain, and noise stirs hunger." He stepped into view. Cain fired. The shot shattered the lantern. Glass and flame spilled across the stairs. Ephraim staggered, not hit, but blinded. He growled, not screamed, growled like something caged too long. Cain ran. Through the cellar, up the back wall, out a shattered window into the dark streets. He didn't stop until he reached the chapel. He locked the doors, barred the windows. He pulled the ledger from his coat and set it on the altar. Then he dropped to his knees and wept. He wept for the names, the weights, the notes. He wept for the red stamps. He wept because he finally understood. This wasn't a slaughterhouse, it was a temple. And the town had been dining on communion for decades. The next morning, Cain stood in front of the chapel with the ledger wrapped in brown cloth under his arm. The sun had just begun to rise over the hollow, casting long, skeletal shadows across the town square. A few early risers dragged their feet through the dirt streets, buckets in hand, shoulders stooped with fatigue or denial. No one met his eyes. He waited. He watched. Smoke already rose from the slaughterhouse chimney. Greasy, gray, constant, like it had never stopped. Behind him, the chapel door creaked open. Verity stepped out in her teaching dress, a worn leather satchel in one hand, a question in her eyes. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked. Cain nodded, his face hard. "I found enough." They stood in silence. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. The town creaked awake. Verity whispered, "What are you going to do?" Cain looked down at the ledger, then back at the plume curling over the treetops. "I need to see the source, all of it." "Cain." "I'm going back in." Verity's breath caught, but she didn't try to stop him. Instead, she said, "Wait." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small red ribbon, frayed at the ends. The children used to say, if you saw a red thread near the smokehouse, it meant someone was going to die. Cain took it. It was soft, old, but it felt like something more, like memory. Where did they see it? Sometimes tied to trees, fence posts. Once, a child said they found it wrapped around a butcher's hook by the schoolhouse well. Cain pocketed the ribbon. They were telling us all along. He left before the town was fully awake, keeping to the back trails and shallow ditches. His revolver strapped beneath his coat, the ledger pressed flat against his chest. The slaughterhouse stood at the edge of the pines like a waiting beast, roof bowed, walls soot-stained, chimney wheezing. The gate was open. That alone made him pause. He crept around the side, where the foundation dipped toward a drainage trench. Here, the earth was soft, the mud dark as liver. He circled toward the back, heart pounding. And there it was, tied to a bent iron fence post near the rear door. A strand of red thread. It danced in the breeze, taut as if freshly tied. Cain stepped closer and saw more, dangling from the rafters above the smokehouse, strung like garlands across the rear shed. Red thread. Some knotted, some torn, all vibrant against the gray backdrop. He entered through a broken side panel. The inside was worse than he remembered. The lanterns were lit low, casting a yellow hue across the steel table. The room was spotless, surgical. The hooks gleamed. The floors had been scrubbed clean. It smelled like bleach and cinnamon. Cain moved carefully, boots whispering over the wet stone. He crossed into the adjoining chamber, the rendering room. A single metal vat sat in the center, still warm, steam curling off its surface. On the walls, dozens of jars lined the shelves, each labeled with a number. Some had clear liquids. Others held slivers of meat, small bones, and in a few, teeth. One jar had a finger, a child's, ring still on it. Cain turned away, bile in his throat. He He descended deeper into the narrow hallway that led beneath the floorboards. The air grew colder, the walls narrower. A hatch at the end of the corridor was sealed with 2 iron bars and a lock carved with a strange sigil, a circle of teeth around a cross. He pressed his ear to the wood, a hum, not mechanical, musical. Someone was humming. He stepped back and drew his revolver. Then a voice behind him said, "You came early, Brother Cain." Cain spun around. Ephraim stood at the hallway entrance, blocking the light, arms folded. His coat was gone, his sleeves rolled. In one hand, he held a cleaver. In the other, a Bible. "You should have waited," Ephraim said. "The feast is Sunday." Cain raised the revolver. "Move." Ephraim chuckled. "We knew you'd come back. You've tasted it, haven't you? Not the meat, the truth. That's the richer flavor." "I've seen your books," Cain said. "The names, the weights, the notes." Ephraim nodded solemnly. "We are meticulous. The offering must be recorded. They're people. They were lost, forgotten. We gave them purpose. In death, they became nourishment, communion. That's more than most get. You're insane." "No," Ephraim said softly, stepping closer. "We're faithful." Cain pulled the trigger. The shot roared in the narrow space. Ephraim staggered, fell to one knee. The Bible dropped, the cleaver clattered. He clutched his shoulder, blood spilling through his fingers, but he smiled. "You'll need more than bullets, Brother Cain. You think you're here to end it, but you're here to replace it." Cain stepped over him and kicked open the hatch. The room beyond was dim, lined with candles. A stone altar stood in the center. Chained to it was a man, young, trembling, gagged. His eyes pleaded. He couldn't be more than 20. Cain rushed forward, cutting the chains with his knife. The boy collapsed into his arms. Footsteps behind him. Silas. The butcher moved silently, blade in hand, apron already stained. Cain didn't wait. He fired again. Missed. Silas lunged. They crashed against the altar, the blade skittering across the floor. Cain punched, hard, again and again. Silas groaned, blood spraying from his mouth. Cain grabbed the nearest object, a branding iron, and drove it into Silas's throat. Silas thrashed once, then fell still. Cain pulled the boy to his feet. Together, they staggered back into the hall. Ephraim was gone. Outside, the red thread fluttered wildly now. Dozens of strands, a storm of crimson dancing in the wind. Cain didn't stop. He didn't look back. He ran. Past the vats, past the jars, past the altar. He ran until the pines opened, until the chapel bell rang once, and the chewing finally stopped. By the time the first roof beam collapsed, the flames had swallowed the slaughterhouse's throat. They rose like confession. The sound of fire filled every alley, every home, every breath in Wilton's hollow. It was not a scream, it was a reckoning. And still the townsfolk stood frozen, not because they feared the fire, but because of what they heard inside it. Voices, not screams, not cries, voices. Soft, deliberate, dozens, hundreds, reciting names, one by one, the names from the ledger, spoken not in agony, but in witness. Miriam Granger, Levi Thatcher, Esther Bleak, Jonas Wren, Tabitha Kemp. The crowd began to shudder. Some dropped their food, some fell to their knees. Others ran, but stopped at the edge of the square, as if invisible hands pulled them back. They could not leave. The smoke carried something with it, something that knew their bones. Cain watched from the schoolhouse roof, breath held tight. It's working. Verity whispered. "No," Cain said. "It's remembering." The fire didn't rage like a beast. It moved with intention, licking the chapel's windows, curling around the bells. When it reached the spire, it didn't burn. It peeled. Beneath the white paint and cedar shingles, something old began to emerge. Symbols, etchings carved deep into the wood, a spiral of teeth, a hollow circle with a line of salt. Cain stared. It was never a chapel. The bells rang again. Only now they didn't toll. They sang. It wasn't metal against metal. It was voice. A boy's voice. "Help us," it cried. "He told us to kneel." Another. "She watched while they cut." Another. "They made us into blessings." And another. "I still feel the brine." Cain felt the ground tilt beneath him. He looked to Verity, who clutched her head, eyes wide. "They're not just speaking," she said. "They're in us." Around the town, people dropped to their knees, not in prayer, but as if forced. Their mouths moved without will, echoing the names, the sins. Elias, aged 7, bone broth. Patience, bled in spring, sweet liver. Mothers clutched their ears, fathers wept. The school children stared at their red thread ribbons and began to scream. Verity looked to Cain, panic rising. "They don't know how to carry it. It's too much." Cain didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall, limping, arm bandaged. Ephraim, alive. He walked slowly, hatless, coat burned at the sleeve, the blood on his shirt steaming in the heat. He stepped into the square with no fear. The townsfolk parted before him like stalks of wheat. "Do not listen," Ephraim said. His voice was soft, gentle, but it rippled through the crowd like thunder through soil. "Close your mouths. Silence your hearts. The dead do not speak, they accuse." Cain raised his revolver. Ephraim turned calmly. "Put it down, brother. You're done. I haven't even begun." He gestured behind him, and from the tree line came others. More brothers. Tall, pale, wearing butcher's aprons and clerical collars, 4 of them. Eyes sealed with wax, each carrying a cleaver shaped like a cross. "The order has many chapters," Ephraim said. "Wilton is but one tongue in the mouth." Verity whispered, "We didn't burn deep enough." Cain stepped forward. "Then we light another match." But Ephraim raised his hand, and the air changed. The fire stilled, the names stopped, the bells went silent. The square held its breath. Then, a low tone. Not from the chapel, from beneath. The ground pulsed, the soil cracked, and something rose, a hand, bone and ash, wrapped in linen, fingernails black with brine, then another, then a skull, then a chest. The earth had been seeded. The bodies were waking. Ephraim closed his eyes. "We fed them so they'd remember. We salted their bones to preserve the knowledge. You thought you were uncovering a crime. But all along," he turned to the people, "you were building a kingdom." The risen dead stood in rows. Not ghouls, not monsters, but recognizable. Mothers gasped, wives fainted, children called out names they remembered from dreams. A young girl stepped forward, face gaunt, eyes soft. She looked up at Ephraim and whispered, "Why did you call me back?" Ephraim faltered, and then she screamed. A scream so pure and piercing it shattered the silence. The dead screamed with her. Not in terror, but in justice. Cain fired. The shot caught Ephraim in the throat. He dropped. The crowd scattered. The brothers charged, but the risen met them, grabbing their arms, dragging them down into the roots they once fed. One by one, the brothers vanished beneath the earth. Only Ephraim remained, gasping, crawling, blood pooling. The little girl knelt beside him. "You named me Waste," she said, and she closed his eyes. Cain stepped into the center of the square. The air buzzed with voices, names still echoing, but now fading, returning to rest. He raised his voice. No more hunger, no more silence. The ledger is closed. The smoke rose, but now it smelled like ash. Not meat, not memory, ash. The sun didn't rise that morning. It bled. The smoke from the slaughterhouse still drifted above Wilton's hollow, but now it was thin, like a thread unspooling. The bells no longer rang. The hymns had stopped. The chapel was a blackened husk, its spire broken and pointing down like an accusation. Cain stood at the edge of town, staring at the field where the fire had ended and the silence had begun. They'd buried the dead at dawn. Not the risen ones, not the butchered ones, but the believers. The ones who had known and said nothing. The ones who had sat at the table again and again and called it tradition. They had not been killed by flame or blade. They had been taken by guilt. Some had wandered into the woods and never come back. Others had laid down and simply stopped breathing. A few clawed at their own ears, trying to unhear what they now remembered. Verity stepped beside him, boots muddy, dress torn at the hem. "They're sending investigators," she said quietly. "From Montgomery. Maybe even Washington." "Too late," Cain replied. The fire spoke louder than any report. She held out a torn page from the butcher's ledger. It was marked with 3 names, names no one in town recognized. "New arrivals?" he asked. "No, they were never here." He stared at the ink. "Then why are they listed?" Verity hesitated. "Because those names match children who went missing, 2 counties over, and one of them disappeared just last year." Cain felt the wind shift. The brothers hadn't been just in Wilton. He turned and looked to the horizon. The road stretched out of the hollow like a scar, long, winding, and still traveled. "They'll move," he said. "Change their names. Set up new steeples, different faces, same hunger." Verity folded the page. "So, we follow." Cain nodded. "We follow." They returned to the town square, now littered with overturned benches and spoiled meat. The tables had been broken apart for firewood. No one wanted to sit at them again. A handful of survivors wandered like ghosts, faces hollowed by revelation. A boy scrubbed at a bloodstain on the side of the schoolhouse. A woman stood in her garden, staring at the place where her scarecrow used to be, before she'd found bones inside its frame. A red ribbon hung from the chapel door. Cain plucked it down and tucked it into his coat. Inside the charred remains of the slaughterhouse, the floorboards still hissed. But beneath them, the passage had collapsed, sealed in fire and ash. The pit was gone. The bones were dust. But Cain knew better than to believe it was over. Some knowledge survives the flame. He moved through the wreckage and found the ledger he'd thrown into the pit. The cover was scorched, the pages brittle, but it had not burned. Verity watched him pick it up. "It doesn't want to die," she said. "No," Cain replied. "It wants to be opened again." He turned the pages, names, weights, notes in red ink. But near the end, something new, not just names, but scripture. Verses that weren't in any Bible Cain had read. "And lo, the hunger shall be made holy, and through the cutting of the innocent, the tongue of the body shall speak. The meat is remembrance. The sinew is obedience. The fat is offering. He turned another page. He who butchers without guilt shall inherit the feast. And one more. The voice shall move from one hollow to the next, as it was in the beginning. Verity whispered, "It's not a ledger, it's a gospel." Cain didn't reply, because on the final page, a symbol was drawn in dried blood. A map, a dotted path, starting in Wilton's Hollow, arcing east, ending near a place marked simply Jasper's Wake. A note beneath it read, "Establishing new cell. First harvest expected by winter." Cain stared at it, and he felt something move behind his ribs. Not fear, not anger, resolve. He closed the book. "We leave at dusk." Verity nodded. "They won't stop." "No," he said, "but neither will we." That night, as they packed their bags, one last knock came at the chapel door. It was the little girl, the one who'd risen from the soil and silenced Ephraim. She stood barefoot, her dress still streaked with ash, her hair braided with red thread. She held something out, a jar. Inside, floating in cloudy liquid, a tongue. Cain hesitated. The girl said, "He told me to keep it, but I want you to have it now." Cain took the jar, hands steady. The girl smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He was wrong," she whispered. "It doesn't make the voices stop." She turned and walked back into the woods, vanishing like mist. Cain placed the jar in his coat, and when he and Verity left Wilton's Hollow that night, they didn't say goodbye, because no one was watching, because no one wanted to remember, because the smoke still carried names. By winter, Wilton's Hollow no longer appeared on maps. The county clerks claimed it had never existed. Rail lines stopped listing it as a depot. The postmaster scratched out the name on every envelope that dared mention it, as though a name could be erased with ink alone. But the wind still passed over its remains, and the smoke, though thinned and faint, still rose when the moon was right. Hunters in the woods swore they heard bells at midnight, and sometimes, if they stopped long enough by the creek, they'd find ribbons in the water, red, soaked, and frayed. Cain knew it hadn't ended, because endings require silence. And he still heard the names. He and Verity reached Jasper's Wake in the second week of November. A quiet place, Cotton Town. Church with white siding and too many windows. Smiling folk, clean streets, pies on porches. Too clean, too quiet. At first, there was nothing unusual. No obvious butcher's shop, no slaughterhouse hidden in the woods, but the signs were there. Beneath the hospitality, behind the hymns, they heard it again. The humming, faint, from behind church doors. Not the voice of a woman, not a child either. Something in between. And when Verity walked past the schoolyard, a boy whispered, "My brother says we're going to be chosen." The boy smiled with one missing tooth. He said our meat smells sweeter when we don't cry. They set up their watches, took shifts, traced deliveries. One crate marked Blessed Bone had been shipped from a non-existent supplier in a hollowed-out town in Georgia. Another bore the name Creole. Cain nearly broke his own hand punching the wall, but Verity kept him steady. "We have to wait," she said. "Strike too soon, and it moves again." So they waited, until the first disappearance day. That's what the children called it, almost playfully. One day a year, someone simply didn't come back. A girl, a drifter, a newborn. No funerals, just a silent seat and a steeple bell. Cain attended the sermon. Pastor Mallory spoke with a smile so wide it creaked. "In every season," he said, "there must be offering. The Lord delights in what is given freely. The congregation nodded, even the children. Cain stood slowly in the back row. He held up a page from the ledger, the Gospel of Wilton's Hollow, and the room fell silent. Pastor Mallory paused, lips trembling just once. Cain spoke. "I know the smell. I know the symbols. I know what's buried beneath your altar." A few gasps. The pastor laughed softly. "Now, son, why would we hide anything? The altar is open to all." Cain raised the jar, the one the girl had given him. The tongue inside twitched. A woman fainted in the third pew. Cain set the jar down on the pulpit. "Then speak, Pastor," he said. "Speak without it." Mallory's mouth moved, but no sound came. His lips stretched, his throat pulsed. Nothing. The townspeople began to murmur. A man wept. A little girl clutched her mother's hand and whispered, "Why isn't he talking, Mama?" Verity stood at the entrance, revolver drawn. "The harvest is over," she said. Chaos erupted. People screamed. The choir ran. Mallory collapsed, clutching his throat, blood seeping from his ears. The windows cracked as a low hum surged from beneath the floorboards. Verity kicked open the altar trapdoor. The smell hit first. Brine, smoke, burnt hair, and beneath it, sugar, the sweet, cloying rot of memory preserved. They descended, guns drawn. What they found beneath was not just a chamber, it was a tomb of taste. Walls lined with preserved hands, tongues, thighs, all labeled by date, age, and flavor notes. Blissful fat content, no blemishes, harmonious pain yield. Cain tore a ledger from the shelf. Inside, notes on a festival menu. It listed cuts from local children next to preparation times. Verity vomited in the corner. Cain lit the fuses. This time, they didn't wait for fire to judge. They blew it to ash. And when they rose, the bells didn't toll. They shattered. 3 months later, Cain sat by a fire in Tennessee. Verity had gone to scout a chapel in the Smoky Ridge. Rumors of fasting seasons and meatless weeks that ended with sudden feasts. He sharpened a knife, not for killing, but to feel something metal in his hand. Across from him sat a girl with red thread braided in her hair. "You're looking for them," she said. Cain nodded. "Will you burn them?" "Yes." "Will you burn the towns too?" He paused. "If I have to." She stared into the fire. Sometimes the people don't know they're hungry until someone tells them they've been fed wrong. He looked at her. "Who told you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she sang, low, uneven, a child's lullaby. The same one the butcher had hummed beneath the soil in Wilton's Hollow. Cain stood, walked into the trees, and when he came back, the girl was gone. But the smoke had returned, not thick, just enough to carry a name, one name, his. Cain. They never stopped. Neither did he. Wherever the red ribbons bloomed, wherever the hunger was called holy, he followed, ledger in coat, jar in satchel, Verity at his side. Because this wasn't just a brotherhood. It was a gospel, and someone had to burn the scripture.